can you hear me? No, okay, so Mike.
Okay, can you hear me now? Okay, everyone. Welcome, good morning. We're thrilled to see so many of you here on the first day of the CSW. This panel is a discussion taking stock of all views are welcome. Everyone is committed to thinking about feminist views. That means debate is also good. I just want to reiterate the name of the panel. Can we achieve gender equality in a context of criminalization? Sometimes I have a hard time saying criminalization, so bear with me. So the focus of the panel is to think about why feminists continue to look so strongly towards criminal law as a remedy for harm in violence against women work, but even skeptical of the criminal law as we remove it from reproductive controls, gender rules, and consensual sexual conduct. So that's kind of the focus of the panel. We want to talk about how, with what strengths, to limit the use of criminal law to promote gender equality. And all the speakers will speak to that. We hope to have several examples of where criminal law has and has not effectively promoted women's rights and where people are questioning it. So examples from several countries, issues around this. We want to find the time and we want to find ways to lessen the reliance on criminal law and to think about ways forward, alternate ways forward. So the way this panel is going to be set up is that each speaker will speak for about 10 minutes, and then we will have one round of questions that I will ask them for 5 minutes each, and then we will open it up to everyone. We're not doing bios because you have the bios just to save time and speak about the substance. Jasmine Lovely George is our first speaker. Then we'll be followed by Carrie Iser so Jasmine is from research, also has a long history of working on gender equality in India and in other spaces. There's Carrie Iser from Amnesty, and then Ali Miller, who's a scholar and an activist and currently at Yale.
Thank you, Geeta. Am I audible? Yes. So, I'm Jasmine, and I'm representing a young feminist collective called Research. Research is a young feminist collective that basically works in the global region South, and we follow a sexual and reproductive justice framework. So we believe that sexual and reproductive rights are not single issue based, and because most of us don't live single issue lives, and we believe in actually making interconnections within different movements. We are trying to build interlinkages with our bodies, health, rights, and at the same time with our ecological, economical, and different social crises of different times. At Research, we are trying to work around developing a public advocacy. We are trying to relook at our justice approach, and where we are trying to make it more inclusive. And we are trying to building a community where we can actually bring in expertise from people from across the movements. So that's what we have been doing at Research. And in the last few years, we have been trying to look at some of the shortcomings of penal policies in the regions that we have been working in. So we have been looking at criminal law as a framework and how it has been working for the last few decades. And this is still a work in progress, a theory in making, and we really are looking towards the other movements on trying to build a relationship where we can actually look for something more than just looking at a criminal justice framework. So for example, in Egypt, we were working around female genital mutilation, and we realized, like, in 2008, there was a law that was actually passed where they criminalized FGM. And how did it really work out? And in the last 10 years, has this passing of this specific act, did it really make any difference? Did it come about with a behavior change? And we did realize that in the little study that we have been trying to conduct, that it hasn't really resulted in any kind of attitudinal change within the communities. There hasn't really been any sharp decline in the incidence of FGM. Similarly, if we actually go towards Brazil, where a Domestic Violence Act was passed in the year 2006, again with a huge win for a lot of movements, but at the same time we did realize that the law, which does ask for penal policies, at the same time also did mention about shelter homes, providing women with a lot of other sort of preventive measures also. But somehow most of the focus has been very specifically restricted to penal policies and not on the other aspects of it. Similarly, where I come from in India, in the scope of juvenile justice, we have a lot of push nowadays towards decreasing the age of culpability. So we are actually saying that a person as young as 16 can be held accountable for an act which can be criminal in nature. So we are suddenly increasing more and more people around, bringing them within the scope of criminal aspect. And at the same time, we have another law which is protectionist in nature, where we are trying to protect children from any kind of interaction or engagement with sexuality. So we are trying to deny them of any access to information around sexual and reproductive health and rights. So we do realize that across this region, we seem to see a pattern around criminal justice system where it seems to be limiting in nature. I mean, the intention with which we actually resort to a criminal system, and it's limiting that it focuses solely on the perpetrator, so it focuses on removing the perpetrator from the community, but really doesn't address the issues or even the experiences of the victim or the survivor. Nobody really takes that into account. So how do we frame around that? Similarly, it doesn't really talk about the structural inequalities. So criminalization seems to think of issues as an individualistic approach. It doesn't talk about how women or these marginalized communities are living in communities, how suddenly the communities are broken, how when you introduce these legal systems, you suddenly break a lot of ties. So we are really not talking about a lot of breaking of these communities and what is the effect of these communities. At the same time, we do seem to have a lot, I mean, there are communities which have been clearly saying that we also need better health system. We also need better education systems. So while there seems to be a lot of, sole focus on criminalization, we don't seem to have enough data or enough evidence to say that in the last so many decades, we have reached or these criminal policies have in any way made a certain kind of impact. So, looking at some of the existing studies or looking at some of the different legal policies around the region in the global south, we have been trying to look for alternatives. We are at CSW talking about access to justice for rural women and young girls. So are there any alternatives out there? And we always find it fascinating that communities have been telling us, like how some of these communities have been working their own mechanisms. So they have their own alternative dispute mechanism, which might not be similar to the court system. How there have been comprehensive sexuality education, which might not be termed as CSC, but they have been seem to be more effective, have been acting more better in the nature of preventive when it comes to providing people with information, access to sexual and reproductive health information. Instead of just talking about what happens after the crime is committed, how to go about prevention, how to go about actually talking to people, giving them access to information. Similarly, talking about structural inequalities, talking about the economic barriers, talking about racial inequalities. These are some of the things that can be done at a mass movement through public campaigns, be it with sensitization with media, be it sensitization with government policy holders who are actually going to implement these laws. So these have been some of the effective mechanisms that have been worked around, which small communities are working in. So for example, giving a clear example, looking at from Kenya, we did look at how in some of the communities in Kenya, while their intervention on FGM is very much focused on doing community kind of learning, and girls are actually leading this. So we have young girls working in rural communities who are actually pushing for such kind of issues. Similarly, in Brazil, while discussing about Domestic Violence Act, there have been groups from the rural areas who are actually working on land rights. So how they're connecting land rights to domestic violence and actually talking about a lot of structural inequalities, which does in a way affect domestic violence. So there have been alternatives, it's just that I think so we need to have a little more better connections to all these other existing movements who are working in silos, and how do we actually look for a bundle of remedies which can be effective for people who are trying to access justice, because end of the day we're actually trying to redefine what is justice. If we're really talking about a transformative justice, who is this justice for? If we're talking about rural women and young girls who are trying to access justice, is the current present idea of criminal justice, is it accessible in the definition of time, space, resources, economic resources, is it really accessible? Do people understand this language of the criminal system that is really being pushed for? And because at research, we believe that looking at sexual reproductive health and rights to a justice framework, it's all about talking about the power imbalances, talking about a systematic change, and talking about how do we make it more inclusive so that people across movements can stand up for each other and can make the whole sexual and reproductive health rights more inclusive. Thank you.
Less than 10 minutes. So we'll come back to a series of questions after that. I'm going to hand it over to Ken.
Hi. All right, that's loud enough. Great, well thanks all for being here this very first morning of CSW. It's so exciting to be part of this panel and to see a whole room of people. So as Gita started us off mentioning, what's brought us together is this question of how feminism's reckoning with use of criminal law. And for me, coming from a human rights organization, I think we're in a similar place in the sense that we're also critical of states overreaching policing power and abuses in the criminal justice system, and then at the same time also strongly believing in the role of justice systems being important in delivering accountability. So what I'll cover today, oops, got to get my PowerPoint presentation started. I'll cover sort of Amnesty International's perspective on this issue. I'll give a quick example that's pertinent to rural women. Oh, there it is. Okay. And then I'll also be presenting a new piece of work called the Body Politics series. That picture of it is now up there. So what's brought us to this work is a few different things. Primarily seeing how widespread criminalization of sexuality and reproduction, how widespread this is as a barrier to realizing rights and as violations of rights in every region and in every country. It's also a matter of, we've been seeing some real advantages, I think, as Jasmine was referring to also, to what using this frame of criminalization can do in terms of uniting our movements, helping us break down silos and see connections between sexual and reproductive rights issues. And also in terms of having, our colleagues say who don't work on sexual and reproductive rights, helping them understand why this is relevant to their work too. So, oops, did it go away? Yeah. Oh, there it is, okay. Always some adventures with PowerPoint. So we tend to think of criminalization of sexuality and reproduction as when consensual sexual and reproductive actions, decisions, behaviors, or the expression of identities is restricted or punished. And it's important to take, or we at least take a very, very broad view to this, seeing the full scope of how it plays out. On the sort of more obvious end, there are direct criminal regulations that, for example, you think of when there's a law that directly says this is banned, abortion's banned, for example. But other times we see indirect regulations that use a range of laws and policies related to public order or morality that are used indirectly to police certain populations, often used in a discriminatory manner. And the law also has the effect of reinforcing and exacerbating existing stigma and discrimination and punishing people in perhaps more subtle ways like denying services, housing, invasions of privacy, fines, etc. So in terms of how we see this play out, sorry. Yeah, okay. Oh, that's that, okay. Sorry about that. Looking at this framework globally allows us to see the commonalities and who is impacted across the board. As I mentioned, it's not limited to one region or anything like that. But we look at these 7 issues which I've put up on this slide, and we've seen, perhaps in some regions, some might be more common than others, but they're essentially everywhere. In Latin America and in some US states, they're increasing abortion restrictions and laws that punish women for conduct during pregnancy. In Europe and North America, the actions of people living with HIV are attracting more sort of attention from legislators and prosecutors in many countries in Africa. There are laws criminalizing same-sex conduct that have intensified. Parts of Asia, the Middle East, and North Africa, criminalization of sex outside marriage and restrictions on access to basic sexual health information and services continues. So essentially, across all these contexts, we're seeing the work that criminalization is doing. It's essentially disproportionately affecting people who can't or don't conform to dominant social norms, punishing people for decisions they make in relation to their economic circumstances, their sex, race, gender expression, immigration, or health status, or disability status, etc. Oh, thank you, Jasmine. Okay, so when we're seeing these violations, the question is, what can human rights bring to this, bring to address these things? And there are a range of different principles we think about in terms of just figuring out, is criminal law the last resort, and what obligations are states supposed to be relying on if they're resorting to criminal law. And I'll just go over these very quickly since we don't want to get into a whole law school session or anything, and I'm not a lawyer. But there's legality. Crimes and punishment must be defined in a manner that's accessible to the population, so people must know in advance what is presumably going to be criminalized. There has to be a legitimate aim or purpose. Must be necessary. Human rights can only be violations of human rights can only be justified when other less restrictive responses would be inadequate. They must be, policies must be proportionate and suitable to pursue an aim that must be legitimate. And of course, laws and policies must be applied equally to everyone and not discriminatory in their impact. And among the issues we talked about, their laws are almost always have a discriminatory impact. Thank you. Okay. So I'll just give a very quick example. I know we don't have much time, but I picked this particular example because it's relevant, I think, to how criminalization plays out in rural communities. And this is an issue that takes different forms around the world, but the laws that I'll talk about were based on research I did in the United States, which has a set of laws that target pregnant people, and particularly those who use drugs, and based on a belief that they've caused or risked harm to their fetus, and the laws could have put out there with a legitimate aim of trying to improve public health. But how that works in practice is when women find out about the law, they might then be scared to go to the doctor because that's where they're tested for drugs without their consent or even their knowledge. And word gets out, people become then scared to go to the doctor, and similarly scared to go to the hospital to give birth because that's the site where they're reported or even arrested or have their children taken. So we find that even though it's designed, or the intention is legitimate to improve health, it actually causes people who need health care to avoid it. And this results in racial and gender discrimination, and it particularly impacts low-income women and those unable to access healthcare services, frequently in rural areas. So the point I wanted to make about this, just to wrap that up, is that we need to think more about the impact on rural communities, where criminalization is often an expedient response for policymakers to show that they're doing something, but this is masking a much bigger issue, which is that there's a lack of investment in public resources, and criminalization, can often be a sort of quick band-aid approach. I think I'm getting, oops, that one didn't look very well. Oh well. That was just the main points I wanted to make about this particular issue. It's essentially the criminal law punishing people, for their inability to access services. Okay. I know he just strict on time, so I wanted to make sure. Okay, so the last thing I wanted to talk about, if we had time to get to it, is that I'm excited to announce we're releasing a new series of documents today. You're the very, very first to learn about it. And it's so new, I haven't even checked if it's available on the website yet. But it's a series of 3 documents, the first of which we're releasing today. The first is a primer, which is basically like a very long, detailed resource manual that you can learn about It covers the 7 issues I mentioned earlier. It covers all the principles I mentioned earlier. It goes into great detail on all these issues. Then there's also a campaigning primer, which is more of a practical document if you're interested in running campaigns. And then later in this year, we'll be releasing a training manual. And I put a bit.ly up there. You can find out if it works, if it's posted yet. But otherwise, it'll be available on the website, amnesty.org. If you search under latest campaigns, it should pop up right there. And we also did sign-in sheets, which might be making their way around. So if you put your name down, I can send it to you. That's it, thanks.
We move to Alice.
I'm the last speaker, so we'll have time for questions and discussions after me. So I appreciate your patience in waiting through these important conversations. Gita introduced me as a scholar activist, and I want to talk about the way in which a book that I happen to be lucky enough to edit, but if you've ever edited 17 different authors, you know it's a lot like herding cats, so it is both heaven and hell. But the book is about, it's called Beyond Virtue and Vice, and it's about the international human rights and the criminalization, the criminal regulation of sexuality, gender, and reproduction. And in that book, we have these 17 different voices in 14 chapters talking about histories and experiences of the means and the messiness of what happens when feminists engage with criminal law, because we all do. I know for myself, I started my work as a public defender in the 1980s. I was a feminist, and I wanted rape taken seriously, but I also knew that the criminal justice system in the United States was racist and classist. So I ended up working in a public defender office while talking about the need to take violence against women seriously. And I think that contradiction, that need to recognize those tensions across what we need to condemn while not trusting the system that we're using to condemn it, is at the base of a lot of the discussion that we're having here. And that point is really at the base of the book and the articles written by many of the authors. So what I'd like to do is tell you a little bit about how I and my co-editor, Mindy Roseman, who both, it's very much by accident that we're both in New Haven in the US at Yale. We're both also scholar activists. How we located the book in kind of historical movements. I'll use a couple of examples of some of the authors and their key foci, and then I'm going to try to reflect on what we learned from editing our authors' pieces and thinking about some of the conversations here. And I want to note that Gita didn't say so, but she's one of the activist authors in the book. So as we enter the discussion, she has an interest in this topic, not just a timekeeping interest. And I want to close with something that I said that I think that we're hearing across the board, which is this notion of thinking about the power of the state as something we call on but treat with skepticism. And what Mindy and I ended up focusing on in thinking about our work, and I'm going to give you these 3 words and hopefully we'll have time to talk about them, is the ways in which we think about the work of the criminal law with empathy, solidarity, and accountability. So I want to go back and think about those words. And I want to be clear that in the book and in the work that I do, we are thinking about equality across gender and other power structures, right? So we're trying to hold on to an intersectional framework so that the points about rural and race that Jasmine and Carrie have made, the ways in which the criminal justice system affects people differently, even while it's supposed to speak the same, is a central part of our work. So this reckoning about the criminal justice system is actually very long in the making. And I want to bring people back to the sort of history of women's human rights, where in the sort of mid-late 80s, the move to sort of storm the citadel of human rights and make human rights, this mainstream movement of human rights, respond to the needs of women, whether they were economic or reproductive or in terms of violence. And so there were a whole host of feminists who began placing not just violence against women, but a whole host of issues that were of concern to many differently defined women. And I want to return us at some point to what do we include in the scope of women, such that trans women and a range of gender diversities can be understood in this conversation. But these feminists were asking, how do we understand calling on the state even while we don't trust the state? And as I was thinking particularly about the way in which violence against women, which was one of the most important issues to move through the women's rights movement in the late 80s and early 90s, ended up powerfully focusing on the state's criminal justice system to condemn violence. That was something we counted as a victory. But even at that time, many of us can recall that a number of the feminists involved in these movements, and I'm going to name here Sunila Abasakera, who wrote a letter after the Vienna conference and said, you know, the focus on violence against women is leaving out economic and resource distribution. It's dealing with the criminal state, but it's not talking about all the other power differentials. We cannot only work with prosecution to fix the problems of women. She wrote that letter, right, in the mid-90s. So this is a question that feminists have had on the agenda for a very long time. So in the book, we attempt to take that question, how do you think about the fact, exactly as Carrie presented, that criminal regulation ought not be placed on same-sex behavior, sex outside of marriage, and the rate and reproduction and questions, and I know we're debating in feminism, but sex, you know, the exchange of sex for money, sex work, how do we think about that? How do we have those discussions about removing the criminal law at the same time as we're often advocating for intensifying prosecutions and more punitive punishments for people that we think or we know are violating the rights of women? So we have two kinds of disagreement that I think we need to tease in discussion. One is, and this is something that I think everyone has called on, open, sometimes disagreement, but at least lack of working together across the sex issues we put up. Same-sex, HIV, sex outside of marriage, which includes both adultery and what many states call fornication, sex for money, adolescent sexuality. Can we work together? Do we have agreement on decriminalization across this range of issues? Included in that, of course, is abortion. At the same time, there's another kind of question, which is related to this, which is how do we think about human rights principles and solidarity when we work to confront violence against women? How do we think about calling on the criminal powers of the state? And in what principles are we using to limit the powers of the state that we know we don't trust, even while we're calling on it to condemn? So one of the things that our many authors addressed, and I'm going to just give a few examples from the 14 different chapters. In Brazil, Sonia Correa and Maria Karam did a historical review of the expansion and contraction of the criminal law explicitly in regard to sexuality, but they give us the history about how it mattered for race and class. How is it that some issues became political issues at different periods of time, and they're all about race and class? They appear to be about protecting women or saving women, but they're also about saving some women, but not all women. Or they're about responding and regulating some women for the benefit of some men and some women, right? The divisions are always